On the night of November 14th, 1942, in the pitch-black waters off Guadalcanal, an American battleship opened fire without ever seeing its enemy. There were no searchlights, no muzzle flashes to guide the gunners, no visual confirmation at all. Yet within minutes, one of Japan's most powerful battleships was being methodically torn apart by shells fired with near-perfect accuracy. The ship delivering that punishment was USS Washington, a vessel that, until that moment, had barely registered in public consciousness. This was not a carefully staged fleet engagement or a clash planned months in advance. It was an improvised, chaotic night battle, in which confusion, darkness, and fear ruled every decision. Japanese commanders believed they held the advantage. They had superior night-fighting doctrine, crews trained for close-range engagements, and the expectation that American battleships were blind after sunset. What they did not realize was that USS Washington was fighting a different kind of war, one in which radar, discipline, and restraint mattered more than visibility. In less than 10 minutes of sustained fire, Washington would sink the Japanese battleship Kirishima, cripple enemy cruisers, and shatter Japan's attempt to annihilate Allied forces on Guadalcanal, all without suffering a single combat casualty. It was one of the most lopsided and decisive surface actions in naval history. And yet, for decades, it remained largely absent from popular World War II narratives. At the center of this extraordinary engagement stood Rear Admiral Willis Lee, a commander whose background made him an unlikely revolutionary. Lee was not a flashy naval celebrity or a political favorite. He was a quiet, methodical officer, an Olympic gold medalist in rifle shooting, and a fierce advocate for gunnery precision and radar integration. Long before Guadalcanal, Lee had argued that future naval combat would be decided by sensors, data, and fire control rather than eyesight and tradition. His views were controversial inside the U.S. Navy, which still revered visual spotting and classic line-of-battle tactics. Radar was treated as a useful aid, not a decisive weapon. Lee disagreed. By 1942, he had transformed USS Washington into a floating test bed for a new form of naval warfare, drilling his crew relentlessly in radar tracking, target discrimination, and fire coordination under conditions where human vision was useless. Guadalcanal would be the ultimate test. Henderson Field, the Allied air base on the island, was the linchpin of the entire campaign. If Japanese surface forces succeeded in bombarding it, American air power would be neutralized, and the island, and possibly the South Pacific, could fall. The Japanese fleet sent to destroy it included battleships specifically tasked with wiping the airfield off the map. When USS Washington and her task force intercepted them, the outcome of the campaign hung in the balance. What followed was not just a victory, but a demonstration that naval warfare had irrevocably changed. Yet even as Washington returned from battle intact, her achievement would be quietly downplayed, her commander sidelined, and her role reduced in official narratives. The reasons for that silence would shape U.S. naval culture long after the guns fell silent, and explain why the most decisive American battleship of the war became its most underrated. In the immediate aftermath of the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, the scale of what USS Washington had achieved was not yet fully understood, even within the U.S. Navy itself. The engagement had unfolded so rapidly and under such chaotic conditions that reports were fragmentary and often contradictory. What could be established with certainty, however, was extraordinary. Using radar fire control alone, Washington had detected, tracked, and engaged a major Japanese surface force at ranges and under conditions previously considered impractical for battleship combat. Within minutes, her 16-inch guns scored repeated, devastating hits on the Japanese battleship Kirishima, disabling her steering, wrecking her superstructure, and igniting uncontrollable fires. By the early hours of November 15th, Kirishima capsized and sank, the first Japanese battleship lost to surface gunfire in the war. Just as striking was what did not happen. USS Washington took no direct hits and suffered zero combat casualties. In an era where naval battles routinely produced catastrophic losses, this outcome bordered on the unprecedented. Yet because the action occurred at night, without dramatic visuals or large fleet formations, it lacked the spectacle that usually defined great naval victories in the public imagination. Strategically, the consequences were immediate and profound. The Japanese mission to bombard Henderson Field failed completely. Without that bombardment, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal remained vulnerable to Allied air attack, and their ability to reinforce or resupply the island deteriorated rapidly. The sinking of Kirishima also shattered Japanese confidence in their long-held superiority in night surface combat. For years, the Imperial Japanese Navy had trained extensively for nocturnal engagements, believing darkness negated American advantages in numbers and industrial capacity. Washington's performance overturned that assumption overnight. Radar had nullified darkness itself. From this point forward, Japanese commanders could no longer assume that night favored them. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of the battle was not technological. It was cultural. Rear Admiral Willis Lee had deliberately restrained his fire until radar solutions were absolutely stable, resisting the instinct to engage as soon as targets appeared. This discipline maximized accuracy and conserved ammunition, producing decisive results in minutes rather than hours. It was a methodical, data-driven approach utterly at odds with traditional naval thinking, and it worked. Despite these implications, the U.S. Navy's institutional response was cautious, even uncomfortable. Radar's decisive role raised difficult questions. If one battleship, properly equipped and trained, could dominate an enemy force in total darkness, what did that say about existing doctrine, officer training, and the prestige of surface commanders raised on visual engagement? Acknowledging the full significance of Washington's victory meant admitting that long-cherished assumptions were obsolete. As a result, official summaries emphasized the collective nature of the Guadalcanal fighting rather than the specific contribution of radar-directed gunnery. Willis Lee received recognition, but not elevation. USS Washington returned to duty without fanfare. Her achievement folded quietly into the broader narrative of the campaign. Over time, the story faded, overshadowed by aircraft carriers, island landings, and more dramatic fleet actions. Yet among naval professionals, the lesson was unmistakable. The battle had demonstrated that information, integration, and restraint could outperform experience and tradition. Modern naval warfare would no longer be decided by who saw first, but by who understood first. USS Washington had proven that truth under fire, at the moment when failure would have cost the Pacific War its most critical foothold. That such a victory could be minimized rather than celebrated is precisely why Washington remains, even today, the most underrated U.S. battleship of World War II. As the Pacific War continued into 1943 and 1944, the implications of USS Washington's night action at Guadalcanal quietly spread through naval planning rooms, even if they were rarely acknowledged in public. Radar-directed gunnery began to appear less as an experimental novelty and more as a foundational requirement for modern fleets. Training manuals were revised, exercises reshaped, and fire control procedures increasingly built around sensor data rather than visual spotting. Yet the transformation was uneven. Many senior officers, shaped by decades of daylight engagements and traditional doctrine, remained uneasy with a system that shifted authority from human judgment to instruments and operators working behind steel bulkheads. This institutional hesitation mattered. The United States Navy was innovating rapidly, but it was also managing egos, hierarchies, and reputations forged long before radar existed. In this environment, the Battle off Guadalcanal was treated as confirmation of a trend rather than a decisive break with the past. That framing diminished its significance. The victory became a footnote to the broader Guadalcanal campaign instead of a case study in how naval warfare itself had changed. Meanwhile, the ship at the center of that transformation continued serving without ceremony, escorting carriers, guarding task forces, and performing duties that rarely generated headlines. Her contribution was steady, professional, and largely invisible, precisely the opposite of how wartime fame is usually earned. The marginalization of this victory was also shaped by shifting narratives of the war itself. As aircraft carriers came to dominate popular understanding of naval power, battleships were increasingly portrayed as relics, symbols of an older era eclipsed by air power. This interpretation oversimplified reality. While carriers became decisive strategic tools, surface combatants still played critical roles in controlling sea lanes, protecting task forces, and denying the enemy freedom of movement. USS Washington exemplified this reality. Her success did not contradict the rise of air power, it complemented it. By saving Henderson Field, she preserved Allied air superiority over Guadalcanal, enabling carrier and land-based aircraft to operate effectively. Yet these interdependencies were difficult to communicate in a compelling narrative, especially compared to dramatic carrier duels or amphibious landings. As a result, the story of Washington receded further into obscurity. Even within post-war histories, her role was often reduced to a technical curiosity rather than a decisive turning point. This neglect had consequences. It reinforced the mistaken belief that battleships were irrelevant by late 1942, ignoring how properly employed surface ships could still exert enormous influence under the right conditions. The reality was more nuanced. Battleships were no longer dominant by default, but they were far from obsolete. USS Washington demonstrated that adaptability, training, and technological integration mattered more than platform alone. Her victory was not about brute force, but about understanding how to apply force intelligently in a changing battle space. That lesson, quietly absorbed by planners and tacticians, would shape naval doctrine long after the war ended. Yet because it lacked spectacle and challenged comfortable assumptions, it remained underappreciated. In that sense, Washington's fate mirrored her achievement: decisive, influential, and largely unseen, a ship that changed the course of events without ever becoming a symbol. By the end of World War II, USS Washington had accumulated a service record that few American battleships could match in terms of strategic impact. Yet she never achieved the iconic status granted to other capital ships. She survived the war intact, not because she avoided danger, but because she was employed with precision and restraint. After Guadalcanal, Washington continued to operate as part of fast carrier task forces, providing anti-aircraft protection, surface deterrence, and a stabilizing presence in some of the most contested waters of the Pacific. Her role was rarely dramatic, but it was essential. As the war moved north and west toward Japan, naval warfare became increasingly integrated, with surface ships, aircraft, and submarines functioning as parts of a single system. In that system, battleships like Washington were no longer the centerpiece, but they were indispensable enablers. Yet this shift in role further diluted public recognition. Victory narratives favored singular moments and clear symbols, while Washington's greatest achievement had been preventing disaster rather than creating spectacle. Saving Henderson Field did not look heroic in photographs, but without it, the entire Guadalcanal campaign and the Allied position in the South Pacific might have collapsed. The final reason USS Washington remains the most underrated U.S. battleship of World War II lies in what her story forces us to confront. Her triumph challenged deeply held beliefs about how wars are won. It showed that innovation often succeeds quietly, that decisive moments can occur in darkness without witnesses, and that institutions are often slow to celebrate changes that undermine tradition. Rear Admiral Willis Lee's radar-driven victory was not ignored because it lacked importance, but because it disrupted established hierarchies and assumptions. Acknowledging it fully would have meant admitting that future wars would be fought less by heroic visibility and more by information, coordination, and trust in technology. That lesson was uncomfortable, and therefore easy to sideline. Yet in hindsight, USS Washington stands as a bridge between eras, a battleship that proved relevance not through dominance, but through adaptation. Her guns sank an enemy battleship, But her greater legacy was demonstrating how modern naval combat truly worked. In an age where warfare increasingly depends on sensors, data, and integration, the lessons of USS Washington are more relevant than ever. She did not become a legend because she was loud or celebrated. She became one because, at a decisive moment, she worked exactly as intended and changed the course of the war without anyone noticing.